This story is titled, My Babysitter. Falsely accused me of SA, parents disowned me. But years later, the truth came out and they want me back. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey everyone, I've been thinking about writing this for a long time, but it's been tough to put it into words. Still, I think it's time. This is the story of how 3 years of my life were completely taken from me because of a lie. I'm still picking up the pieces, but here goes. It all started when I, male, was 19. Life was simple. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. I had a part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store, was saving up for college, and spent most of my free time playing video games or hanging out with friends. I didn't have it all figured out, but who does at 19, right? Then one evening, my cousin Emily called me out of nowhere, and everything started to unravel. She'd recently moved back to the States after living abroad for a few years, and she was still getting her life together. She was in a pinch because her regular babysitter, let's call her Miranda, needed the night off. "Can you do me this one favor?" she asked. "I really need someone I trust." I didn't think twice. Emily and I had always been close growing up, and her kids were sweet. It wasn't like I had big plans that night anyway. So I agreed. She promised me it'd just be a few hours while she went to a work dinner. Honestly, I thought it'd be a chill evening. Play with the kids, feed them, put them to bed, and maybe raid her snack cabinet. The night went off without a hitch. Her kids, Sam and Sophie, were 5 and 7, and honestly, they made my job easy. We played some card games, built this ridiculous pillow fort in the living room, and laughed a ton. Around dinner time, I whipped up some grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, my go-to I can't actually cook meal. The kids devoured it like I was Gordon Ramsay, which was a small win for me. After dinner, we watched a Disney movie, and by 8:30, they were yawning. I got them into bed, tucked them in, and read them a story before calling it a night. Once they were asleep, I cleaned up the kitchen, checked my phone, and then parked myself on the couch to watch some Netflix while waiting for Emily to get back. She came home around midnight, thanked me a million times for helping out, and handed me some cash for my trouble. I remember telling her, "No problem, anytime," as I left. I walked home that night feeling pretty good. I mean, it wasn't a big deal, but it felt nice to help her out. The next morning, everything came crashing down. I woke up to someone pounding on my door, like full-on banging, like they were trying to break it down. My heart was racing as I jumped out of bed, still half asleep, and opened the door to find 2 cops staring at me. One of them said, "Are you Michael?" I nodded, confused as hell. "Yeah, that's me. What's going on?" "You're under arrest," the officer said. Before I could process what he'd just said, they spun me around, cuffed my wrists, and started reading me my rights. My brain was struggling to catch up. Under arrest? For what? What's going on? They wouldn't give me a straight answer. "You can talk to your lawyer," one of them said. My lawyer? I didn't even know why I needed one. I tried asking more questions, but they shut me down and shoved me into the back of their car. I was taken to the station, still in my pajamas, feeling completely lost. They sat me in this tiny interrogation room and finally told me what was happening. Miranda, Emily's babysitter, the one who wasn't even there that night, had accused me of assaulting her and touching the kids inappropriately. At first, I thought they had to be joking. Miranda? I hadn't even seen her that night. Hell, I haven't ever seen her before. She wasn't anywhere near Emily's house while I was babysitting. But the cops weren't joking. They started throwing all these accusations at me and my head was spinning. "This is insane," I said over and over. "I didn't do anything. I was just babysitting." They didn't care. The more I tried to explain, the less they seemed to believe me. They kept pressing me with questions, twisting my words, and making me feel like I was already guilty. It was like they'd made up their minds before I even walked into that room. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about truth or facts. It didn't matter that I was innocent. It didn't matter that the evidence was shaky at best. I was a man, and in their eyes, that was enough. The moment Miranda pointed the finger at me, my fate was sealed. There was no investigation, no real attempt to understand what happened. Just an accusation, and suddenly, I was the villain. After what felt like hours, they let me go home, but not before charging me with crimes that made me feel physically sick. As I stepped out of the station, my parents were waiting for me outside. My mom's face was pale, and my dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in a day. I thought maybe they'd hug me or tell me we'd figure this out together. Instead, they just stood there, staring at me like I was a stranger. My dad broke the silence first. What happened in there? I tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled. They, they're saying I did something to Miranda and the kids? It's all lies, Dad. I didn't do any of it. You have to believe me. My mom shook her head and muttered, How could this happen? Like I wasn't even there. I looked at her, desperate for some kind of reassurance, but she just avoided my eyes. The car ride home was dead silent. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, while my parents sat up front like I wasn't even there. Every few minutes, my mom would sigh or whisper something to my dad, but they didn't include me in the conversation. It was like they didn't know what to say, or didn't want to hear what I had to say. When we got home, my dad finally turned to me as we stood in the driveway. Michael, he said, his voice low, this is serious. These are heavy accusations. We need to know everything. I already told you everything, I said, feeling the frustration build up in my chest. I babysat for Emily, I took care of the kids, and that's it. I didn't even see the babysitter that night. How can she accuse me of something I didn't do? My mom just looked down at her feet. My dad didn't respond. He just nodded stiffly. I sat there, feeling completely lost. This was my family, the people who were supposed to have my back, and they didn't even know if they could believe me. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in my room most of the time, trying to process everything. My parents barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was awkward and forced. My mom would ask questions like, Are you sure there's nothing else you're not telling us? My dad kept saying, We'll figure this out. But he didn't sound convinced. I tried to call Emily to tell her what was going on, but she didn't pick up. Instead, I got a text from her that said, I can't deal with this right now. That was it. No follow-up, no explanation. I felt like I'd been cut loose, like everyone was abandoning me. And then the whispers started. Small town life, right? Word travels fast, and it gets twisted along the way. By the time I stepped outside the house for the first time, it felt like everyone already knew, or thought they knew. People stared at me like I was a criminal. At the grocery store, someone literally walked out of the aisle when they saw me. Even at work, the vibes were off. My coworkers didn't outright say anything, but they stopped chatting with me during breaks. My manager called me into his office one day and said, Until this gets cleared up, I think it's best if you take some time off. That was code for, we don't want you here. Friends I'd known for years suddenly stopped answering my texts. People who used to come over to play video games or hang out just vanished. It was like I'd been erased and replaced with this horrible version of myself that only existed in Miranda's story. You'd think I was Diddy with all the wild accusations swirling around me. But the stares and whispers weren't even the worst part. I overheard my mom on the phone one night, her voice shaky. She was talking to someone, I couldn't tell who, and she said, I just don't know what to believe anymore. That hit me harder than anything. She didn't believe me. My own mom, the person who raised me, doubted me. I wanted to burst into the room and yell, How could you even think I'd do something like that? But I didn't. I just stood there, while my chest felt like it was caving in. It wasn't long before my dad confronted me directly. We were sitting at the kitchen table, and he came right out with it. Michael, I need you to be honest with me. Did you do it? Those words still ring in my head to this day. I remember looking at him, feeling like I'd been stabbed. I couldn't believe he was even asking. No, Dad, I said. I would never hurt anyone, especially not family. How could you even think that? He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the table, tapping his fingers like he was waiting for me to slip up. Then he said, Miranda's story. It's hard to ignore. That was it for me. I stood up, walked to my room, and slammed the door. If my parents didn't believe me, who would? My older sister came by the next day. She didn't say much, just sat on the couch scrolling through her phone. At one point, she looked up and asked, Why would she lie about this, Mike? What does she have to gain? That question knocked the wind out of me. I didn't know. I couldn't even begin to guess. All I could say was, She's lying. I swear to you. She's lying. She nodded, but it felt hollow, like she was trying to convince herself. I don't know, Mike. This whole thing, it's bad. Really bad. She left not long after, and I sat there staring at the wall, wondering how things had gone so wrong so fast. The only person who seemed to believe me was my younger brother, Jake. He was 17 at the time, still in high school, and he didn't care about the rumors. I know you didn't do it, he said one night while we were sitting in my room. You're my brother. I don't need proof to know you wouldn't hurt anyone. Hearing that meant the world to me, but it also made me feel guilty. Jake was taking my side while the rest of the family was turning their backs, and I knew it was probably putting him in a tough spot. People at his school were talking about me. He told me that much, and I hated that he was getting dragged into it. Things at home kept getting worse. My parents stopped talking to me unless they absolutely had to. Meals were quiet and tense. My dad avoided sitting next to me at the table, and my mom started spending more time in her room. It was like I'd become a stranger in my own house. The rumors about me weren't just my burden, they'd become theirs too. Small town whispers don't just stick to one person, they ripple outward. My dad, who worked at a local company where reputation was everything, was starting to feel it at his job. Co-workers avoided him, and meetings felt colder. He'd come home exhausted, like he'd been fighting battles I couldn't see. One night, I overheard him talking to Rachel. He said, "We can't have him here, not with these charges hanging over his head." I couldn't believe how far they were going with this. Once they heard a lie about me, they ate it up. They wanted me gone. A week later, my dad sat me down again. "Michael," he said, "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while, until this all gets sorted out. You're kicking me out because of a lie. It's not about that," he said, but we both knew it was. It's about the stress this is putting on the family. We need space to figure things out. Space. That word felt like a slap in the face. Space to do what? Pretend I didn't exist? I looked at him, my voice trembling with anger and frustration. "So you don't believe me? Fine. But when the truth comes out, I don't want an apology. I don't want anything from you." He didn't respond. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, as if he'd already made peace with his choice. I packed a bag that night and left. Jake offered to let me crash in his room, but my dad shut it down without hesitation. "He needs to figure this out on his own," he said, like I was some kind of unwanted burden. The words shattered what little was left of my pride. My heart sank as I stood there, trying to process how my life had spiraled so completely out of control. Just days ago, everything had been normal. Now I was walking out the door with nowhere to go, unsure how it had come to this. I ended up staying with an old friend from high school. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated, but I could tell even he was a little wary. People were talking, and the rumors were brutal. Some folks believed Miranda's story without question. Others weren't sure what to think, but didn't want to take the risk of being associated with me. I tried to keep my head down, but it was impossible. Every time I went to the store or walked down the street, I felt like everyone was staring at me. And maybe they were. It didn't matter that nothing had been proven yet. People had already made up their minds. The worst part? My court date was still a month away. That meant a whole month of living in limbo, wondering if I'd ever get my life back. Jake visited me as often as he could. He'd bring me snacks, sit on the couch, and try to cheer me up. "Don't worry," he said one night. "We're gonna figure this out. I promise." I wanted to believe him, but it was hard. The weight of everything, the accusations, the rumors, the betrayal, was crushing me. When the trial finally arrived, it felt more like I was walking into my own funeral than a courtroom. The whole thing felt stacked against me before it even began. Miranda, the babysitter, sat there with tears streaming down her face, telling a story that didn't even make sense. She claimed I'd made advances toward her and hurt Emily's kids. I was completely baffled. It was like she'd written a script designed to make me look like the worst person alive. My court-appointed lawyer did his best, but let's be real. He was overworked and underpaid. He tried bringing up the ring camera footage from Emily's house, which proved I never left the living room while babysitting, but the judge barely cared. He tried to use my phone location, showing I was at Emily's house the entire time, but that was brushed aside too. Miranda's tears seemed to outweigh any logic or evidence. The jury didn't even deliberate long. When they came back with a guilty verdict, it was like the air was sucked out of the room. 3 years in prison. And because of the charges, I was automatically placed on the sex offender registry. That label followed me out of the courtroom, into the prison van, and through the gates of hell. Prison itself is bad, but being there with sex offender next to your name? That's a whole different nightmare. The second the guards processed me, I could feel the stares. Inmates talk, and it didn't take long for everyone to know why I was there. I wasn't even in my cell for 24 hours before the first fight broke out. Some guy twice my size cornered me in the showers, muttering, "We don't like kids abusers in here." Before I could say anything, he punched me in the stomach so hard I couldn't breathe. I barely managed to stumble back to my cell after that. Fights became a regular thing. I tried keeping my head down, but that only worked for so long. One day, I got jumped by 2 guys while I was walking to the cafeteria. The other, someone shoved me into a wall hard enough to leave bruises. The guards? They didn't care. To them, I was just another body taking up space. The registry made everything worse. Even inside prison, it followed me like a scarlet letter. There were rules about who I could talk to, where I could go, and what privileges I could have. Everyone treated me like I was guilty, like I didn't deserve to breathe the same air as them. I started working out, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. If I was going to survive, I needed to be stronger, physically, mentally, emotionally. I learned to throw a punch, even though I hated the idea of violence. I learned to keep my back to the wall and my eyes on the exits. Visits from my family were rare. My parents came once, about 6 months in. My mom looked like she'd aged 10 years, and my dad barely said a word. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't say they believed me. They just sat there, uncomfortable and awkward, until the guard told them time was up. Jake, though, Jake was different. He was my rock. He visited as often as he could. He'd sit across from me in the visitation room and talk about anything other than the trial or prison. "You catch the game last night?" he'd ask, even though he knew I couldn't. He'd update me on school, friends, and whatever drama was going on in town. 2 years crawled by in prison, each day heavier than the last, until one day, Jake walked into the visitation room with a serious look on his face. He sat across from me, folded his hands on the table, and said firmly, "I've been saving up and I think I can hire a better lawyer for you." At first, I didn't believe him. Lawyers aren't cheap, and Jake was still in high school. "Jake, you don't have to do that," I said, shaking my head. "Shut up," he said, grinning. "I already did. Justice costs money, but I'm not letting you stay in here." For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Jake had somehow scraped together enough money to hire a real attorney who specializes in wrongful convictions. Looking back, I realize I never had a chance. The courtroom wasn't about finding the truth. It was about winning and losing. And I never even got to play the game. My public defender was drowning in cases, barely had time to go over the evidence, and definitely wasn't ready to go up against a prosecutor who knew exactly how to spin a narrative. The Ring camera footage? Ignored. My phone location? Brushed aside. Miranda's crocodile tears were worth more than any facts I could present. Justice isn't about the truth. It's about who can afford to fight back. I couldn't. But Jake could. And that made all the difference. The lawyer visited me about a week later. He was sharp with this no-nonsense attitude that made me feel like maybe things were about to change. "I've reviewed your case," he said, flipping through a folder of documents. "And I'm going to be honest, this was a mess. But we're going to fix it." He started digging into the evidence that had been ignored during the first trial. He pored over everything. The Ring camera footage, the phone data, even the testimony Miranda had given. "Her story has holes," he said. "Big ones. We're going to find out why." Months passed, and the lawyer kept digging. Every time I saw him, he had this determined look on his face, like he was piecing together a puzzle only he could see. He didn't share much with me at first, just vague updates about how he was working on something. It was frustrating not knowing, but I trusted him. I asked him once, "Do you think you can get me out of here?" He leaned back in his chair and said, "It's not about thinking. It's about finding. And trust me, I'm finding what we need." I clung to his updates like they were a lifeline. After what felt like forever, he finally told me he'd filed a motion to get my case reopened. My heart raced as he explained that there were inconsistencies in the original trial and new information that the court needed to hear. "I can't promise you anything," he said, "but this is our shot." It took weeks for the court to respond. But then the news came. The motion was approved. I was going back to court. And that's how I found myself. Sitting in that courtroom again. It felt surreal. My lawyer sat next to me, calm and focused, while I tried not to fidget. He leaned over and whispered, "We're going to make them listen this time." I didn't know what he had planned, but I nodded, hoping he was right. After 2.5 years, it felt like maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come out. The courtroom was packed that day. Some people were there out of morbid curiosity, others to see if the story they'd believed for so long would crumble. Emily was there, sitting in the back with her arms crossed. My brother Jake was in the front row, leaning forward like he was ready to jump out of his seat if I needed him. Miranda was called to the stand early, just like before. She came in with the same tired performance, the tears, the fragile tone, the poor me act. For a moment, I worried that the jury might fall for it again. But something felt different this time. Her story wasn't flowing as smoothly. Her confidence seemed thinner, like even she didn't fully believe in her performance anymore. My lawyer started questioning her, and at first it seemed like routine stuff. He asked her to clarify her timeline from the night I babysat, which she had repeated so many times it probably felt automatic to her. She claimed she wasn't at Emily's house that night, but had overheard something concerning later, which had prompted her to go to the police. Miss Parker, my lawyer said, you stated that you returned to Emily's property after 11 p.m. to collect some personal belongings. Is that correct? Yes, Miranda replied confidently. And you also stated that while outside the property, you overheard something disturbing. Yes. Interesting, he said. Can you explain why the Ring camera footage from Emily's house does not show you arriving or leaving that night? The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Miranda's confident demeanor cracking. I don't know, she stammered. Maybe the camera wasn't working properly? Maybe, my lawyer replied. But the same camera managed to capture everyone else who entered or exited the property that night. Delivery drivers, Emily herself, even my client. Yet somehow it missed you entirely? I don't know, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. The jury was watching her now, their expressions hardening. It was clear they weren't buying it. My lawyer let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Miss Parker, were there any ongoing issues between you and Emily during the time you worked for her? Miranda's head snapped up, and for a split second, panic flashed across her face. No, she said quickly. None. No issues at all? He pressed. No, she repeated. He paused, glancing down at the documents in front of him. Let's talk about the credit card charges, he said casually. Miranda's face turned pale. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice shaky again. Of course, my lawyer replied, pulling out a stack of papers. For the court's reference, these are bank statements from Emily's account. Over the course of several months, there were numerous unauthorized charges made on her credit card. Charges that, upon investigation, were traced back to you, Miss Parker. And the murmurs started immediately. Miranda's face turned red. That's not true, she said weakly. Oh, it's very true, my lawyer said. We also have surveillance footage from multiple stores showing you using Emily's card to make these purchases. Would you like me to present that footage to the court? Miranda didn't respond. She stared straight ahead. He continued, Miss Parker, did Emily confront you about these unauthorized charges in the days leading up to my client babysitting for her? Another long pause. Miranda's lawyer stood to object, but the judge overruled it. Answer the question, the judge said firmly. Miranda finally muttered, Yes, she did. And how did you respond? I told her it was a misunderstanding, Miranda said quickly, but she wasn't convincing anyone. My lawyer nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting that answer. A misunderstanding, he repeated. Interesting. Considering Emily texted you the day my client babysat, explicitly accusing you of stealing from her to buy drugs. Would you like me to read those text messages aloud? The courtroom was dead silent again. Miranda's shoulders slumped. She looked truly defeated. But my lawyer wasn't finished. He walked back to the evidence table and picked up another document. For the court's reference, we've also obtained records showing that Miss Parker has a history of similar behavior at 2 previous jobs. Both employers reported missing funds, and one even pressed charges, though she managed to avoid conviction by agreeing to pay restitution. Would you like to address that, Miss Parker? It turned out that she had been using stolen money to fund her drug habit. This wasn't just desperation. It was calculated. She had accused me to cover herself up. The courtroom shifted. The jury had already put the pieces together. Miranda slumped in her seat. No fight left in her. I didn't look at her. I looked at my mother. Her face was pale. She had believed every word Miranda said. Believed I was a monster. And now, sitting there as the truth unraveled, she looked like she was crumbling under the weight of it. But it was too late. She had made her choice when it mattered. And I wasn't about to let her guilt change anything now. The jury didn't need more explanation. The motive was clear. Miranda had been stealing from Emily for months and knew she was about to get caught. Emily had confronted her, and rather than face the consequences, Miranda panicked and accused me to deflect attention. She'd destroyed my life to save herself. The judge called a recess, and as I sat there, the weight of everything began to hit me. I looked over at Jake, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. We're getting there, he mouthed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I actually believed him. When the session resumed, my lawyer called Emily to the stand. She looked nervous walking up there, but her determination was clear. Emily hadn't testified in the first trial. Back then, she had stayed silent, caught in the whirlwind of Miranda's lies and accusations. But not this time. Emily recounted her relationship with Miranda in detail, laying bare how things had started to fall apart in the weeks leading up to that night. She described missing money from her accounts, unusual charges on her credit card, and finally the confrontation via text messages. I gave her a chance to explain, Emily said, her voice steady, but all she did was deflect. Emily's testimony wasn't just about the theft, though. She painted a picture of Miranda's character that the jury hadn't seen before. She talked about the constant excuses, the suspicious behavior, and how Miranda had become increasingly unreliable at work. Looking back, Emily said, I should have seen the signs sooner. Then the jury deliberated for hours, and those hours felt like years. Jake stayed by my side the entire time, refusing to leave the courthouse. Every now and then, he'd try to distract me by talking about random things, but I could tell he was just as anxious as I was. When the jury finally returned, I braced myself. My lawyer told me to stay calm no matter what, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Not guilty. The words didn't register at first. It felt surreal, like I was hearing someone else's story. I heard Jake let out a loud cheer behind me, and then my lawyer shook my hand firmly, saying, You're free. That's when it hit me. The judge dismissed the case, and I was officially exonerated. I sat there for a moment, overwhelmed by relief. It felt like a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted, and I could breathe again. Miranda's fate was basically sealed at that point. Once all the evidence came out, the prosecution hit her with charges for perjury, theft, and fraud. Watching her get escorted out of the courtroom, head down and totally defeated, I felt some kind of satisfaction that finally she actually had to deal with the fallout of her own actions. When I walked out of that courthouse a free man, my parents weren't there. I didn't expect them to be. Their silence over the years had been loud enough to tell me where they stood. But Emily was there, standing near the steps with her kids. The moment they saw me, they ran straight at me, throwing their arms around me in a hug so tight it nearly knocked the breath out of me. For the first time in years, I felt warmth instead of suspicion, innocence instead of judgment. Emily stood a few steps back, her eyes a mix of guilt and relief. I know this won't change anything, but I'm so sorry, she said. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? She hadn't accused me. She hadn't done what my parents did, but she had still believed it, still let the lies take root. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to be angry at her the way I was at them. She had been manipulated too, another victim in all of this. So I just nodded. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all I had to give. A week later, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking like they'd aged decades in the time I'd been gone. My mom was the first to speak. Her tears welled up in her eyes as she said she was sorry. She apologized for doubting me, for turning her back on me when I needed her most. My dad followed, his words stiff and formal, as if he'd rehearsed them. He admitted that they had failed me, and that their fear and confusion had clouded their judgment. It was clear they wanted to rebuild the relationship, to pick up the pieces and move forward like nothing had happened. But I couldn't give them that. For years, I had begged them to believe me, to stand by me when the world was against me. Instead, they chose to trust the lies of someone they barely knew. That betrayal wasn't something I could forgive with a few words or a hug. I stood there listening to their apologies, watching my mom cry and my dad struggle to maintain his composure. I could see the guilt etched into their faces, but it wasn't enough. The wounds they had inflicted ran too deep. When they finished, my mom reached out, as if hoping for some sign that I would let them back in. I stepped back instinctively, the wall between us still firmly in place. I can't do this, I said quietly. Not now. Maybe not ever. They didn't argue or try to convince me otherwise. My dad nodded solemnly, and my mom wiped her tears. But what did they expect? They didn't trust me when it mattered most. They let me stand alone when the world turned against me. I had no one to fight for me except Jake. Now they wanted forgiveness, as if their regret could erase the years of abandonment. But I wasn't ready to pretend none of it happened. As the door closed behind them, I wasn't just shutting them out. I was choosing myself, and part of me knew I might never let them back in. The court settlement came a few months after my exoneration, awarded through a state compensation program for wrongful convictions. It wasn't a fortune, just $50,000 for each year I'd spent in prison, but it was enough to give me a fresh start. It felt like a small validation, a formal acknowledgement of how much had been stolen from me. Of course, the money couldn't erase the 2.5 years I'd lost, the relationships that had crumbled, or the stigma that still lingered in my hometown. But it gave me something I hadn't felt in years, the ability to take control of my life again and rebuild on my terms. But being exonerated didn't mean I was free. The registry lingers, even when erased. Employers hesitated, neighbors whispered, and people didn't check court records. They just Googled my name. And what they find is years of headlines tying me to a crime I didn't commit. Some jobs ghosted me, others pretended not to know. But the tension was always there. I wasn't just reclaiming my life, I was proving I was more than an accusation. But to some, I'd always be that guy. Staying in town wasn't an option. The whispers, the stares, it was suffocating. I packed my things and left with Jake, the only person who never doubted me. He didn't hesitate, and neither did I. As for Miranda, her world fell apart after the truth came out. The life she had so desperately clung to crumbled under the weight of her own lies. She had built her existence on deception, and when it all came crashing down, there was no one left to save her. I heard bits and pieces over time. How she struggled after her release. How the same people who once blindly defended her now avoided her like a disease. Jobs wouldn't keep her. Relationships fell apart, and she became exactly what she had tried to make me, an outcast. And honestly, it felt good to know she was suffering. Not in a petty way, but in a justice was served kind of way. She didn't just ruin my life, she ruined hers, and now she had to live with it. Meanwhile, I've moved on. I left my old life behind, and I mean that literally. I started fresh in a different country. New city, new job, new people. No whispers, no pity, no lingering side eyes. Just a clean slate. And yeah, I met someone. She doesn't know me as the guy who was falsely accused, or the guy who lost years of his life to a lie. She just knows me, and that's all I ever wanted. So, for everyone who doubted me, abandoned me, or treated me like I was already guilty, keep your apologies. I don't need them. I've got a new life now, and it's better than anything I left behind. But to any guy reading this, know this could happen to you. One accusation, one lie, and your entire life can be ripped away before you even understand what's happening. The truth doesn't matter when people have already decided you're guilty. Be careful who you trust. Be smart about the situations you put yourself in. And if it ever happens to you, fight like hell, because no one else will.